Welcome to episode 4 of Chasing the Dragon, a podcast about my first foray into Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, first edition. My name is Jason Wood. You may know me as the Mad Cleric, a past writer for madadventurers.com, and currently for my own site, madcleric.com. This week, we're going to talk about the effect of nostalgia on AD&D. My current project, Chasing the Dragon, is essentially an attempt to experience what was experienced by the first D&D players. In learning AD&D and playing all of Gygax's modules, I'm not simply chasing the dragon named Gary Gygax. I'm chasing the dragon of nostalgia, trying to get back to those experiences of the very first players. So to talk about that tonight, I've invited Jason Rush to join me as my guest on the podcast. Jason is a friend of mine who lives here in the New Orleans area, and he's going to be in my first AD&D group starting this Friday night. Well, Jason, thanks for being here tonight.
No problem.
In my living room, staring at a computer.
That's great.
So tell us about your history with D&D, starting with your earliest memories of playing.
Well, I can remember being a kid and a friend of mine approaching me and saying, you know, there's this new game out there called D&D, and I'm thinking Monopoly or, Chutes and Ladders. And he's like, no, you actually get into a character and you almost act it out like a play. It's like, well, that sounds neat. I'd like to do that. How
old were you?
Let's see, that would have maybe about 9 or 10 years old. So I got into this group, and it was a group of kids, 3 kids, and our DM was one of the kids' dads. Looking back on my experience and having listened to your podcast, my experience was very different because we didn't really die that much. And I think we didn't die because you had a dad who was having an opportunity to hang out with his son and his friends, and he wanted it to go well.
Right.
And the worst thing he could have done was to just kill us off in the first session. So we tended to live. Now there were a few deaths, and that those just reinforced, I think, what he was already thinking, because people cried. And I think one kid actually got up and left the house and went home and cried to his parents. So it was a kindler, gentler D&D that I started out with. So
when you think back on that, what do you really treasure from those early games? Like when you think of the nostalgia of AD&D, is it the taste of Mountain Dew in your mouth and the smell of pencil erasers? What is it that takes you back?
Well, what I liked about it was, you collected action figures as a kid, and you'd set them up, and then you just kind of look at them. And then some people would even, have them shoot each other and then fall. But with D&D, it's like you actually got to breathe life into your toys,
mm-hmm.
And that's what was really appealing to me as a kid. And I've role played off and on for the last 30 years, and being 45 or like 35 years. And no matter what I'm playing, be it Savage Worlds or Warhammer or Star Wars RPG, Talislanta, anything, I always go back to that initial experience and kind of rethink and relive what happened to me in those AD&D games. Mm-hmm. So I always go back to it. It's just very nostalgic to me. Now, the last time I played it, I was probably in college. So we're talking 25 years ago since I played it. And that's why I was so excited about what you're doing, because I've thought about doing the same sort of thing and getting a group going. But 3 kids, busy practice, lots going on. And DMing is very demanding, and I appreciate you doing it. But no, that's why I jumped on it. It was like, this is so awesome. I'm going to get to relive a part of my childhood.
So what versions of D&D have you played? So you start on AD&D, but what other editions have you played since then?
Let's see. I have the 2nd edition books. I don't have any specific recollection of playing it. So either I bought the books and just read them and enjoyed reading them and didn't play, or I played them and it just wasn't a very memorable experience. The last edition I played was not the most recent one. The one before that was what?
Fourth edition. Yeah, and that's when you and I met, was playing 4th edition.
4th edition. And I found 4th edition suffered from the what goes on in the MMO games. Mm-hmm. You had your, and I'm drawing on terms that I've only overheard and I barely understand, but like you had your tank, you had your range guy, you were really pigeonholed in these roles that you had to have in order to function as a group.
Right.
And that to me felt very stale.
Did you ever feel, were there ever moments when you were playing 4th edition that you felt like you were playing the Dungeons and Dragons of your youth?
No. I mean, I enjoyed the role-playing aspect of it, but the mechanics, they just didn't appeal to me as much. Now, having gone back and read the books, they're
the AD&D books.
The AD&D books, they're clunky in a good sort of way. I mean, I do like the way the more current editions had kind of a heterogeneous aspect to them, where all the classes had skills and abilities that kind of mirrored each other and were all in sync. Whereas if you look at the old edition of AD&D, it's like, okay, well, he has infravision and he has +1 with a sword, and so it's not like skills that kind of are all in sync. It's like each class is its own little island unto itself.
Radical discontinuity between classes and races and all that.
But maybe it's not good from a game concept standpoint. But for me, it's what it's supposed to be. It's D&D as it's supposed to be.
So what are you? So terrifyingly, I'm going to be DMing you and others who have played this before. So what do you hope to get out of playing AD&D again in terms of enjoyment and nostalgia? I really am not. I'm telling this to all of you listeners. I'm really not going to try to murder everyone immediately, but I'm terrified as to what might happen with the roll of the dice. So, what are you hoping to get out of the game?
Well, I'm not going to start crying and run to my parents' house if I die. So I've worked that out. But no,
your parents would be very confused, I think.
No, they wouldn't. That's the problem. I'll be like, your D&D character got killed? Okay, can I offer you a beer? No, I just want to like relive that aspect of my childhood and crack open those books that I have had, I mean, for 35 years. I mean, that's a long time to have. I don't know if I own anything that I've had that long, other than these books. So, getting to relive that experience is what I'm looking forward to. And hanging out with a new group of people and seeing how they interpret it and how they play it. Our ages are going to range from what? Who's our youngest person?
Our youngest person in this group,
not extremely young. I mean, probably in there.
I may be the youngest.
You may be the youngest?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm 32, so.
Okay, how old is Chris?
He's same age.
Okay, all right, so 32. Okay, so not extremely young. No, you're not a millennial.
I just barely am a millennial.
Okay, barely millennial. Okay. It'll be interesting to see what y'all think of this system.
Right.
And if y'all say, this is horrible, we ought to be just banging rocks together in a cave, So we'll see. Yeah.
So we'll cut this out in the recording, but for our YouTube viewers, why don't you do a little show and tell and show off some of your AD&D swag you got here?
Let's see. I've got, and we just went. I didn't know what editions these were, and you just.
Yeah, which printings?
Yeah, so this.
You got your rule books here.
My monster manual, which I have specific recollection of buying at a toy store in a mall that was torn down a few years ago. But I have a specific recollection of buying this book. And then, of course, I've got my original player's handbook, to me original anyway, and my DM's guide. And what you told me tonight, which I would not have remembered, is that I apparently purchased all these within a year of each other.
They're all printed around the same time. And then, now the Greyhawk box is the one that's really going to make people
and this one
wet their pants.
This is a Greyhawk book, and we actually laid the map out on your table there. And this, I do have a specific recollection of getting this as a kid. My parents had gone out of town. My dad had a business trip, and it was always their tradition to bring back some kind of souvenir. And it would often be like a snow globe or a keychain or something. And
this is no snow globe, folks.
and I can remember I was on the floor of our family room playing with some Micronauts or something, and my mom pulled that out of her suitcase, and I was like, wow, she gets me. She gets me, because I don't even know that I mentioned it to her, but I guess she knew I was into D&D, and so that's another. I've had that for 35 years, and I pull it out and look at that beautiful map.
So we were just looking at this before we started recording, and for those of you who have been looking at your player's handbook, monster manual, and whatnot since listening to the podcast or reading the blogs, will be stunned at, number one, how much better the font is in this, but also how awesome the artwork is. This is really, really good stuff.
Yeah, it's a completely different production value, and I don't know when this came in terms of like where the other books were, but they had certainly upped their game a lot.
I think they made some money.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, let's move on. We'll go back to our listeners only instead of our viewers. Well, it feels to me serendipitous to be learning AD&D right now because of a new show that recently released on Netflix called Stranger Things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm only 6 episodes in, so no spoilers.
No spoilers.
Don't ruin anything. But Jason, you recommended the show to me, told me I would love it.
Show.
I love it. My wife loves it. We are absolutely hooked on it. We're going to be watching it when Jason leaves tonight. So give a summary to our listeners and viewers. Why should they be watching Stranger Things on Netflix?
Well, I'll tell you from the perspective of a child of the 80s. I saw an advertisement for Stranger Things on Facebook, and I don't even remember what it specifically was, but I immediately looked at it closely because it looked familiar but different. I was like, wait, is that from a movie I'd seen as a kid?
Mm-hmm.
And then I realized it was something new. And I thought to myself, gosh, has somebody actually made a show that celebrates the 80s? And sure enough, that's exactly what it was. I mean, the show's got elements of Poltergeist, Firestarter, The Thing, E.T. in it, and it's all put together in a very fresh way, but at the same time, very nostalgic way. And for a child of the 80s, it's just fantastic. The only experience that I can say was similar would be reading the Ready Player One, which is again a celebration of the 80s, and that's what's interesting about what you're doing, because Stranger Things starts off with 3 kids in 1983, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in general, and they're 12 years old, which I was 12 years old in 1983, so I was those kids. I can remember that back in those days, you could ride your bike all over your neighborhood. Your parents would let you. You didn't have a phone to call them at any time, but nonetheless, I mean, I would leave home before the sun came up, and I would come home at 10 o'clock at night, and I would maybe check in with them once, but we would be in the woods, chopping down trees, building dams, all kinds of crazy things. I would leave the house with a machete, a BB gun, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, combat gear, and they were like, hey, okay, have a good time. Nowadays, you can't leave your front yard, and you can't even have a slingshot. So that's a testament to how things were a little bit different back then. But like I was saying, Stranger Things starts off with a game of Dungeons and Dragons. 4 kids down in the basement playing on, with little miniatures, and Ready Player One does the same thing. I mean, it very quickly into this book, Dungeons and Dragons is pulled in. So I've come to the conclusion that the 80s and Dungeons and Dragons very much kind of go together. I mean, that was kind of a geeky, nerdy subculture, but now as it's having this kind of resurgence and this renaissance, D&D is very much associated with the 80s.
Well, that leads to my next question. I think really since around the time I started playing D&D, 4th edition and then 5th edition was coming up. I think with the onset of games like World of Warcraft and other games, that people are much more open to the fantasy genre. People are much more open to geek culture. But what do you think is bringing about this renaissance that you get a show like Stranger Things? And for those of you who are listening, there is a D&D reference at least 3 times in the show. And if you're not like a fan of horror, like you're going to talk about The Thing or Poltergeist, it's not a horror show. I would call it
it's kind of like an extended Twilight Zone.
Yeah, it feels like one part E.T., one part what was the other one I was thinking of earlier?
It's very Firestarter.
Yeah, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. With like a hint of Twin Peaks, just a hint. It's not goofy like Twin Peaks, but they just absolutely nailed that 80s genre. You'll love it. Watch it, please. But why is this coming out, and why are people playing Dungeons and Dragons more, and why is this 80s renaissance coming out?
Okay, a couple of things. I think a lot of the things that I did as a kid, which you were almost embarrassed to talk about, playing Dungeons and Dragons, reading comic books. I mean, how many people went to Comic-Con this year? How many thousands of dollars are being made at comic book movies now? Lord of the Rings used to talk about The Hobbit in the 80s, and people are like, oh gosh, he's talking about The Hobbit. It's like the nerd Bible. And meanwhile, you've got, senior citizens showing up for the early release of, the Lord of the Rings movies. So something about that sort of that culture, those stories, that media is becoming more mainstream. So I think that has a lot to do with it. I think the 80s was also when you started to see technology really starting to come about, with the Apple computers and in computers in general. We started to see cell phone technology, and what are we? Everybody's glued to their phone these days. Everybody's obsessed with technology. Well, that was kind of the birth of the beginning of that pervasive technology in our lives at all points, connecting everybody to everybody. So the same way that I think people look back on like the Victorian age and want to role play and play games in the Victorian age as being, because it was the birth of electricity and modern science and medicine and things like that. I think the 80s are kind of starting to have that same sort of attraction as being it's sort of the genesis of the kind of things we're reveling in today.
And Ready Player One kind of touches on some of that stuff too, I think, doesn't it?
Well, Ready Player One, in a nutshell, without giving too much away, and again, this book really spoke to me because it's set in a world where a fella who is my age in the future is dying or has died. I can't remember exactly which, but he has created a virtual reality, the world is in such a horrible state that people escape by plugging into this virtual reality. They essentially live their lives in this virtual reality. Well, the fellow that created it, who was basically my age, he was a child of the 80s. So the 80s is reflected throughout this this virtual reality, and kids of the day love the 80s. So it takes place like 20 or 30 years in the future, but the 80s is just people dress like the 80s, they listen to the music of the 80s, and it's all because of the creator of this virtual reality was a child of the 80s and included so much 80s references in the virtual reality. Well, he's dying, or he's died, I can't remember, like I said, and he has essentially laid out a game that anyone can play in the world, and whoever completes the game first becomes the new owner of the virtual reality. And the game is all about the 80s. So and kids, I was playing in a role-playing game a couple of years back, and this young high school girl was playing in it too, and she came in with some kind of T-shirt on. I can't remember what it was, but it was an 80s reference. And I was like, "Do you know what that is?" And she's like, "Well, I read Ready Player One," and I was kind of like, "Oh, okay." Like, she was offended that I was even asking her, if she knew what it was, but. In talking with her and talking with other young kids that are also playing games like this, they'll say things like, well, "Did you see the Terminator in the theater?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I did." Like, "What was that like?" I was like, "Well, it's like watching it on TV, except the screen's bigger." But it would be kind of like somebody who was a real movie buff, like appreciating the fact that somebody had seen like Gone in the Wind in a theater, and that would be really special to them. To me, it seems like, well, it's just one day we said, "Hey, you want to go see this Terminator movie?" But it's a big deal to them.
But you played AD&D as a 12-year-old in 1983.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think there's something to that.
I guess so. I guess it's like
it's like watching Terminator in a theater.
It's I guess it's like buying a Jimi Hendrix album or something, which is something that would excite me if I were to talk to somebody older than me. It's like, "Oh, you actually owned a vinyl Hendrix album," So I guess it's that same kind of thing. So
do you feel like it's necessary for our listeners to go back and to learn AD&D to recapture the nostalgia of early 80s gaming? How can our listeners experience what you experienced?
Well, you got to go. If you're a serious member, you can go put on some 80s music. There's the 80s channel, which you're going to get kind of a lot of garbage there.
You might get rickrolled.
But you get First Wave, which you go listen to First Wave, which is kind of the offbeat 80s music. And like you said, you want to drink some Mountain Dew and some Cheetos, and put your phone away because you didn't have that. It wouldn't. A little while after that, you'd have the phone that looks like a brick and has the big antenna, but read Ready Player One, watch Stranger Things, watch some of those great movies, watch The Thing, watch E.T., watch Poltergeist, and really get a feeling for what that time period was like. Try to avoid the parachute pants, try to avoid the Vans, the OP shirts. Don't dress like Cyndi Lauper, please.
Well, you know what? When I was talking to Jeff Romo and Josh Brown on the first podcast, they were saying, don't bother with AD&D First Edition. Just play Fifth Edition and update all the modules. Okay, so you're gonna disagree.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that. I mean, those modules were made for this rule system, and I think you wouldn't get the same experience at all.
So shots fired across the bow, Jeff and Josh. We expect to see comments on Twitter and Facebook. You're not on Twitter, are you?
I think I think so, but I don't know how it works.
Child of the 80s here.
Yeah.
Not a millennial. Not.
I talked to my 13-year-old daughter on it. I'm on Facebook, so I got that. I made that happen. Right? Yeah.
So you think our listeners at the very least should check it out and give it a shot?
Yeah, I do, because you have to. It's like if you appreciate any kind of hobby, you have to go back to its roots and experience it, from where it all started. And I mean, this is it. This is where people got started in role playing, and to not play that, I think you do yourself a disservice. I think it's a great opportunity to see how it all got started and what it was like. And don't get me wrong, there's clunky stuff in there.
Oh yeah.
But at the same time, it's really neat. And it's funny because, and I talked to you about this, but it's funny how you look at things as an adult versus as a kid. Because I always played role playing. I wanted to play a different race. I didn't want to play a human. I wanted to play an elf or a dwarf because I'm human every day. Why would I want to play? So the whole idea is to do something different. And so I always played elves, and drew on my the Tolkien experience, and elves always seemed neat to me in the Tolkien world. So I always played elves. Well, this time I cracked open the book and I was like, okay, I'm going to be an elf. What am I going to be? I'm going to be maybe a fighter. And I was like, 7th level limit. I don't remember that. Never concerned me as a kid. Either I didn't notice, I didn't care. I know we never had a discussion about it. I mean, our DM never said, okay, we're removing level limits.
Right.
But that, as an adult, I was like, well, that's a real problem. But from 2 standpoints. One, when you're hitting 7th level as a fighter, elf fighter, and everybody else is continuing to get better, and you're just kind of sucking gas in the back now. You've been this heroic elf all this time. That kind of stinks. And the other thing is from a fluff standpoint. I mean, I think of role playing. I think of Tolkien again, and I think of Elrond, and it's like, how can you tell Elrond, you've been alive for 2,000 years, but you're stuck at 7th level, whereas this guy who's been around for 50 years isn't. And that, from a fluff standpoint, it's like, what is that all about? So, it's funny what you look back on and interpret differently and have different concerns. So.
Well, as Daniel Fisher pointed out to me on Twitter 2 weeks ago, Gygax apparently did not like comparisons to Tolkien. I don't know why, but he liked Tolkien. He liked his work. I mean, clearly there's an influence there, but yeah, he wanted his own thing. He wanted he called it humanocentric. I think I quoted like humanocentric world.
Well, and that's getting the Greyhawk book out and flipping through that. Like I was telling you earlier, in the Tolkien world, the elves lived here and the dwarves lived there and the humans lived here, and everybody hated each other, and they only rarely ventured into each other's realms. Whereas if you look at Greyhawk, you look at a typical city and it's like population 2,000 elves, 3,000 dwarves. So from that standpoint, he definitely did something different. He mixed them all up. I mean, that's neater. It's convenient from a game standpoint because you would have to explain why this elf is coming out of his, isolationist forest to come join this party. So I guess from a practical standpoint, it works, but it's definitely a different world than a Tolkien world from that standpoint.
That would be an interesting topic to talk about on a later podcast.
That would, yeah.
Which is a good segue. If any of you are listening and you have some questions, thoughts, criticisms, or topics that you would like to bring up on a later podcast, feel free to tweet me at wood_JasonD. You can always post comments on madcleric.com, or you can even email me at jason@madcleric.com. Of course, we'd really appreciate an iTunes review from those of you who are listening. And this is an important little tip. You may want to get in on this.
Okay.
The first 5 listeners to review the podcast will get preference in an online AD&D campaign that I'm hoping to run this winter. I don't know which module it will be, but it will be a Gygax module AD&D. So you want a seat at the table, the online table. Go ahead and review us on iTunes. We appreciate your review. 5 stars are great. I mean, if we have 6 people and 5 of us give us 5 stars and 1 gives us 4, well, I don't know. We'll have to see what happens then. And more than anything, we appreciate you passing on the podcast to whomever you know that might be interested in trying AD&D, or maybe they played back in the day and it'd be a little nostalgia kick for them. We record these podcasts to inspire others to check out the system, so please pass it along. You got anything in closing, Jason?
Well, I would love to have an invite back.
Oh yeah,
it's to talk about kind of a post-mortem.
Oh yeah,
after we've played, how it was different, and how what you thought your experience was. I think that would be really fun.
That'd be awesome, man.
Hopefully, I won't die too.
I'll try my
and
best.
that case of beer I brought you, that's a bribe. So no, I'm just kidding.
That always helps. Like an iTunes review, that always helps. Well, thanks to all of you for listening once more, and remember, keep on chasing that dragon.